Many years ago, before I became a Christian, my friend Chuck took me to an event at the fairgrounds that included different people speaking from the stage, including a man, I believe his name was Paul Anderson. He was billed as the strongest man in the world. And he did several feats of strength. One is he took a nail and drove it into a board using his bare hand. Another thing he did was he put about 20 people on a table and he knelt beneath it and he picked the table up with his back. He did some other things I don't remember. And then he talked about being a Christian and how important that was to him. I thought about that guy this week because of this series, Unlikely Heroes. We have arrived where we're going to today look at a man whose primary characteristic was his physical strength. The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. Samson, as I said, is primarily known as someone with great physical strength. And of course, it was tied into the length of his hair. Before he was born, the Lord told his mother and father that the baby would be a Nazirite. Now, in the Old Testament, it was very common for someone to take a Nazirite vow. And during the time period of the vow, which was always short term, the person was to consume nothing that was a product of a grape. So no grape juice, no wine, no grapes, no raisins. Also, the person was not to shave or get any kind of a haircut. A man or a woman could take a Nazirite vow. But as I said, it was always short term. And when the time of the vow was over, then the person's head was to be shaved and the person was to offer up a sacrifice. But Samson's parents were told that he would be a Nazirite for all of life. So he was never to consume any wine, grape juice, never to eat any grapes or raisins, and his hair was always to just allowed to be grown long. And of course, he came to be known as someone whose strength was found in the length of his hair. Whether it really was in a magical way or whether it was just that Samson believed that, we don't know the difference, but it's definitely tied in. Samson, being a person of great strength, was also a judge of Israel. But there are things that separate Samson from the other judges that we've looked at. For one thing, Samson never led an army. For another, Samson never redeemed Israel. You see, at the time that Samson was judge, Israel was occupied by the Philistines. Now, prior to this, in the book of Judges, it's always been Moab who conquered and oppressed Israel. But this time, it's the Philistines who conquered and oppressed Israel. And all during Samson's 20 years as a judge, that never changed. Samson never freed Israel from the Philistines. Now, he killed a lot of people, but he always did it single-handedly. On one occasion, he killed 30 Philistines. On another occasion, he killed 1,000. And then his final act, before he too perished, was 3,000 Philistines, men and women, perished when he destroyed their temple. And Samson also perished in that same destruction. On another occasion, Samson killed a lion with his bare hands. So he had great physical strength. He also had some weaknesses. And one of them was his attention seemed to always be on himself and not in his role as a judge or even as a leader of the nation. We know this. His story is found in Judges chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. I urge you to go and read those. I'm not going to read through all of them. But one of the ways that we see Samson and his self-focus is in chapter 14. He tells his parents that he wants to marry a Philistine woman. Get her now for me as a wife. And his father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among our own people? Must you go to the Philistines to get a wife? You see, at that time, people of Israel were not to marry Philistines, and yet that's what Samson wanted, and he made that demand of his parents. Now, there's a lot of details about this that come into play, and again, I urge you to read them, but that was not a successful marriage. On another occasion, Samson went to Gaza where he saw a prostitute, and he spent the night with her. And as a result of that, then he again kills a bunch of people. But then he links up with Delilah. That's his most famous connection with a woman. And it's Delilah who tricks him into revealing the source of his great strength. And he told her it was in his hair. And then, of course, he had his hair cut, and he was then captured by the Philistines, and he was put to work. Well, first they blinded him, and then they put him to work grinding the grain for them in the prison. But his hair, the hair on his head, began to grow again after it had been shaved. And so then there was a great celebration in their temple, the temple of Dagon, and they brought Samson out as entertainment. But Samson had other ideas, and that's when he pushed the pillars apart, and it caused the temple to collapse, and 3,000 people were killed, including Samson. And it says at the end of chapter 16, he had led Israel or judged Israel for 20 years. And so during that time, Israelites could come to him to help him make judgments upon their issues. But Samson never led an army, and he never redeemed Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. So in some ways, we could look at Samson and say, well, compared to other judges, he failed in his ultimate responsibility to free Israel from the Philistines. We don't often think about Samson as a failure, but in that sense, he really was. Yes, he killed a lot of people, but he always did it single-handedly. He never led an army. And even though he killed a lot of Philistines, upon his death, Israel was still oppressed by them. But even with that, I find it interesting that Samson is still listed in Hebrews chapter 11 among people of faith. What shall I say then, beginning in Hebrews 11, verse 32? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. So Samuel is listed with all of these heroes of the faith, we could say, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, which Samson did, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed armies. So on the one hand, we could look at Samson and say he was a failure. On the other hand, he's listed as a person of faith, and certainly Judges makes it clear that the Spirit of God worked within him. We don't know all the details of times when he successfully judged Israel, because there are no details about that contained in the book of Judges. But I think one of the things that's important to remember, and I'm going to talk about this more next week, the Judges is, above all, a book about grace an undeserved mercy. That just as Israel continued to receive God's grace and God's mercy, that Samson is an example of that. That though he never redeemed his nation, and he did certainly some heroic feats, he still received God's grace and God's mercy, which is an exciting thing for all of us to read and to know. That even when we're failures, we still receive God's grace and God's mercy. That even though all of us, like Samson, have strengths, and in his case, it was actual physical strength, we all still have weaknesses. And for Samson, it was being so self-focused. You see, when a leader is so self-focused like Samson, the leader cannot be a good leader. But even in our weaknesses, we still receive God's grace and God's mercy. Who are the beloved? Go and be the beloved.